Look at a modern map, and one country clearly dominates the Northern Hemisphere. It spans 11 time zones, borders frozen oceans, and covers entirely different continents. But go back exactly 1,000 years, and this massive superpower wasn't there at all. No empire, no tsars, no Moscow. Instead of a unified state, this territory was a wild frontier of endless forests and nomadic tribes. The first architects of the nation were Norse explorers, Vikings who sailed east through icy rivers instead of west across the ocean. They used the Volga and Dnieper rivers as highways to reach the Middle East, and the locals called these heavily armed traders the Rus. Over time, these Viking rulers settled among the local Slavic tribes, building wealthy trading hubs like Kiev and Novgorod. They grew rich selling furs and silver between Europe and Asia. In 988, Prince Vladimir adopted Orthodox Christianity, locking in a cultural and political identity that would last for the next millennium. They called this network of cities Kievan Rus. It was prosperous, but it was built on flat, open terrain with no natural barriers to the east, leaving it completely exposed to the catastrophic military force about to emerge from the steppe. In the 1200s, Mongol cavalry swept out of Asia and dismantled the Rus state city by city. The princes tried to resist and were systematically crushed. By 1240, the heart of the region, Kiev, was burned to the ground. For the next 250 years, the remaining Rus lived as subjects of the Golden Horde. They were forced to pay heavy tribute, obey Mongol khans, and live under the constant fear that any sign of disobedience would lead to a new invasion. One tiny, isolated outpost found a way to survive this nightmare. Moscow was an insignificant village that quietly cooperated with the Mongols. Its rulers gained favor with the khans by acting as their tax collectors, gathering silver from other Russian cities to deliver to the horde. Moscow weaponized this arrangement. They used the tax wealth and the years of Mongol protection to quietly build a strong administrative and military foundation. By the late 1400s, they were powerful enough to stop paying tribute and declare independence, finally ending Mongol domination. Centuries under the Mongol khans had proven that a divided Russia was a defenseless Russia. To prevent another conquest, Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, consolidated absolute power under the throne. In 1547, he crowned himself the first Tsar of all Russia, creating a centralized state designed to be too rigid to break. With the center secured, Ivan adopted a radical geographic strategy. Since Russia had no mountains or oceans to stop invaders, he pushed the borders outward to create a massive territorial buffer. He sent armies east, swallowing up the land beyond the Ural Mountains. Beyond the mountains lay Siberia. It was an environment defined by freezing winters, immense forests, and lethal isolation. Cossack explorers endured these conditions for decades, driven by the fur trade and a mandate to plant Russian influence deeper into the Asian interior. This relentless push for space didn't stop until the 1600s, when Russian ships finally reached the coast of the Pacific Ocean. Swallowing Siberia solved Russia's geographic vulnerability from the east by creating the deepest buffer on Earth. However, this expansion into the wilderness came at a cost. While Russia grew larger, it was becoming technologically isolated and dangerously obsolete compared to the powers of Western Europe. By the late 1600s, Peter the Great realized his empire was at risk. Despite its massive size, Russia's military was outdated, its economy was weak, and it lacked the engineering expertise common in European capitals. Peter traveled across Europe incognito, spending months physically working in shipyards and studying modern science, naval engineering, and military strategy from the English and the Dutch. He returned and violently dragged the empire into the modern era. He built a professional navy from scratch, reorganized the army into a modern fighting force, and overhauled the entire government. To lock in this change, he built a new capital on a swamp near the Baltic Sea. He called it St. Petersburg, a city designed with European architecture to force the Russian state to physically face Europe instead of Asia. Peter proved that a massive empire could only survive if it was willing to undergo ruthless internal mutation. He transformed Russia into one of the most feared powers in Europe. This modernized, massive state faced its ultimate test in 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded with an unprecedented 600,000 soldiers, determined to force Russia into submission. The Russian army refused to engage in a decisive battle. Instead, they weaponized their geography. They retreated hundreds of miles inland, burning their own farms, supplies, and towns behind them to ensure the French army had no way to resupply. When the brutal Russian winter arrived, Napoleon's overextended army began to disintegrate. Cold and starvation killed more French soldiers than the actual fighting ever could. Russia had successfully turned its greatest weakness, an endless, freezing wasteland, into a defensive shield. By using their massive size to swallow the French army, they defeated the greatest conqueror of the age. But external strength couldn't prevent internal collapse. By the early 20th century, extreme poverty and the chaos of World War I broke the empire. The 1917 revolution ended the rule of the tsars and led to the rise of the Soviet Union. This new state faced another total apocalypse in 1941, when Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion ever recorded. Entire cities were destroyed, and millions of citizens died in the fighting. The Soviet Union survived by relying on the same strategy as before: geographic depth and industrial endurance. They absorbed the blow, pushed all the way to Berlin, and emerged as a global, nuclear-armed superpower. For decades, the USSR dominated half the globe, but the system eventually stagnated. Internal economic pressure and a demand for political change caused the superpower to fracture. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, losing massive amounts of territory almost overnight. Modern Russia is the outcome of a 1,000-year cycle of collapse and expansion. Its massive size was forged by generations of rulers who viewed territorial depth as the only way to protect their state from total destruction. From Viking rivers to Mongol taxes and frozen battlefields, Russia became the largest country on Earth because it never stopped moving, adapting, and enduring.